Welcome back to the Flowage Podcast, everybody, where today we're starting on part 2 on the Born from Above mini-series. And we covered a lot of ground on part 1. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to that episode, be sure to check that out because it gives the foundation about the existence of our human spirit, some of the terminology that we're going to be using for the rest of this mini-series and really the whole podcast, and even a little rabbit trail where I shared some of the church's reasonings behind how human beings get a spirit and where and how our spirit nature arises from. So definitely check that out. That was episode 13 if you haven't done so yet. But today is part 2, episode 14. And we're going to move on. And to do that, let's review 3 main points that we covered in our part 1 episode, which is first, we established that there is more to our human existence than merely molecules and matter. And 2, how both Jesus and really the whole biblical narrative affirms that fact. And 3, that really regardless of how it gets here or got here, that we have a physically transcendent quality or a spiritually transcendent quality about us that we're calling the human spirit. Okay, now that we got those 3 things established for this mini-series, we can move on and talk about what's the condition of our human spirit, right? And what state is it in? Let's do a temperature check on the human spirit, a status update. And in answering this question, we're going to turn again to the early pages of the Bible, back to the book of Genesis, and walk through the biblical narrative that's there about humankind's struggle with self-centeredness and how that affected and infected the human spirit. Now, whenever folks go back and talk about Genesis stuff, it helps to set up the context with acknowledging this. Every ancient civilization on earth had what we would call a creation story or an origin story. And it's from those stories that they base their understandings about their existence and their understandings about their meaning in life and their purpose. And for followers of Jesus, the first 3 chapters of Genesis is our origin story. And it's filled with all types of allegory and allusion and metaphor and moral takeaways and poetry and really deep spiritual insights. Genesis is just jam-packed with that kind of stuff. But when we look at these ancient Near Eastern origin stories of old, and there's a lot of them out there, it's not so much that you need to believe these events actually happened or actually took place in history in order to just get the point that the authors are trying to make through the story. Got it? I mean, none of those ancient Near East authors, including those that authored the Bible, were trying or even could record history in a way or a manner that we would even consider acceptable in today's historic standards. That wasn't their aim. But what we do have to do is to really enter into these origin stories and imagine it as a very real story, full of truths and full of revelation. Because not only did Jesus use these 3 chapters of Genesis as his foundation to express the spiritual and physical truths, the whole biblical narrative, the whole Bible, is based upon these 3 chapters. It's integrated fully into the biblical story. So if you don't understand the spiritual principles that God intended to reveal in Genesis, in these chapters, you'll kind of miss out on the whole story. I mean, really, the whole Christian Bible is dependent upon and linked to these first 3 chapters. So these are extremely important. And they were extremely important to Jesus when we examine his teachings. And all of the many creation narratives found among all the different peoples, really the groups of the whole world, like I said, there's a lot of them. Followers of Jesus, you see, we have to recognize that it was this particular story that God chose to enter into to reveal himself. And it was this story that God chose to speak to humankind through, at least the most clearly. Therefore, Genesis is super important to us. And specifically for this episode, Genesis sheds an incredible light upon the spiritual condition of human beings and their relationship to God. So in order for us to understand some of Jesus' words to us and really understand the whole story of the Bible, we must get into this creation narrative. We've got to imagine it, open up our hearts to it, and try to understand what it's trying to tell us. Now, some people take the story literal, some don't, but for me, it really doesn't make a notable difference because I believe the spiritual truths that are found in the story, that's the main point and the main ideas that God wants to get across to us. Not whether or not the events happen like this literally. And I hope that makes sense to you listening to this, because this issue about Genesis being literal or not, man, it's caused a great deal of schism, both inside and outside the church. But thankfully for us, we don't even need to go down that route for what we're trying to cover in this podcast. But without going into detail, or at least every detail that there is in these first 3 chapters of Genesis, we can summarize the Christian creation story like this. Genesis shows God created everything in the universe, and he declared all of it good. Why was it good? Because of the same reasons why all of us call something good. There was no suffering. There was no evil. There was no disease. No bloodshed, not even between animals. Nor any type of brokenness, if we want to use that huge umbrella word, brokenness. There was none of that in this paradise-like creation. Everything was beautiful and displayed the wonder and awesomeness of God. And everything was rightly oriented with itself and with others and with God. Everything was in balance and in peace. So it was good. In the story, God creates human beings as well. And as I mentioned in the last episode, God is shown in this creation process breathing his life into the very nostrils of the first human being, which tells the reader that God created and energized human beings with a human spirit so that they could share in his likeness and be able to relate to him. Now, on a side note here, some say that when God breathed in his ruach, that's the Hebrew word for spirit or wind or breath, when he breathed in his ruach, his breath into Adam, that breath, that God was only using his spirit life to more or less, kickstart Adam's mind, his will, and his emotions. Just to get Adam up and running. And that humans are really just organic. We're just matter and molecules. That's our nature. And we really don't have a spiritual nature at all. But I took the position in the last episode that this story shows, along with some of the words that Jesus spoke, and taken in the whole biblical narrative, that God has gifted every human being with a non-corporeal, non-physical, transcendent human spirit. And this spirit is the innermost part of a person. It's the part that guides and directs our lives. And it's even more fundamental and rudimentary than our mind, our will, and our emotions, which, being spirit, it also survives after death. And I'm only reminding of that now because we're going to come back to the human spirit in just a minute here. We covered all that in the last episode, so check that out if you haven't yet. But let's continue on this creation story from Genesis. So if we go on, God is also shown here to dwell among his people freely. But he doesn't force his presence on them. He doesn't force people to do only what he wants. But instead, God gives them choice to either follow him or not follow him. Now, right there is a steep philosophical ledge that drops off into a deep ocean that we don't have time to get into. We're going to talk about that more later when we do some episodes on free will and sovereignty of God and determinism and open theism and so on, which are big academic words that some people like to use. But that's important, so we'll get to that. But we have to pass on some of the, getting into what choice really means, because we got to just focus in on the state of the human spirit. So moving on, it seems to be a really strange part of the story, though, when we read that God places two trees in this paradise, in this Garden of Eden. The tree of life, which of course represents relationship with God, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to be able to determine which is which. In doing this, God tells his precious human beings that they can eat whatever they want in this garden, except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. On the surface level, doesn't that seem weird, right? But what God does by setting apart these two trees is God is endowing humans with free choice. Humans can either walk with God and trust him, and trust that God has his best interest for them in mind, or humans can go about their own way. We can trust God and be aligned with his good intentions, or we can trust ourselves and be aligned with our own self-centered ambitions. And because God does not coerce and he doesn't force behavior, God gives them an option to either choose freely by placing two trees. See, if they didn't have a choice, then they would not be truly free to make self-directed decisions. That's one of those things going on here when God puts two trees in the garden and gives them this choice. Now, next in the story comes what I think is the important part for our podcast. The creation narrative goes on to show God lovingly warning his precious human beings about the consequences of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's a grave consequence that will befall them if they are to act self-centered, and if they don't trust God is actually looking out for them and trying to protect them, that God has their best interests in mind. Quoting Genesis chapter 2, God tells them that in the day that you eat it, you will die. Remember that. In the very day that you eat it, you will die. By saying the word day, that means that the consequence is immediate. It's right away. The consequence is realized in that very moment. Now, if we fast forward a few paragraphs later, we find that the two humans chose to be self-centered, distrusting, and chose their own way. They go against God's loving warning and go ahead and eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But here's the really strange part that often gets totally missed. Adam and Eve both eat of the tree, but we don't see them dying. Nope, they don't die in the day that they eat the fruit. In fact, it appears as though they go on to live a very normal life, healthy, extremely long lifespans, with Genesis chapter 5 even crediting Adam with living 930 years. Now wait a minute here. Something already seems off with the story, and that requires us to do some more digging. So let's do that. Now, as much as people want to criticize these old ancient writers of the Hebrew scriptures because, well, they didn't have the scientific method, they didn't have modern understandings of physics, they didn't have the universe figured out in the same way that we do, and they wrote poetically or used myths or stories or passed down things in an oral tradition. Man, these authors actually knew an awful lot about life and its goings. They had a lot of ancient wisdom and they were super smart. So when they wrote this text of Adam and Eve and the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they didn't just forget about the sentence that was just made a few paragraphs back about God saying that they were going to die in the very day that they eat it. No, they're not idiots, these ancient writers. They knew exactly what they were doing. So we've got a little riddle here to investigate, right? God said they would die in the day they eat the fruit, but Adam doesn't die physically, and Eve doesn't either. They continue living, and Adam gets credited with living 930 years. So what the heck is going on? Where is the death they are supposed to die? Well, if we read on from the text from Genesis 3, it says that when Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, it says their eyes were opened. And what does that mean? It means they had self-revelation. And this is the first result of self-centered. And their first result of being self-centered was that they saw for the first time that they were naked. Now, I can understand how that also seems weird, right? I mean, nakedness, what the heck does being naked have to do with anything? But think about it. Why didn't they notice that they were naked before this? Well, because the story shows that before they ate of the forbidden fruit, they were not self-centered. They weren't taking notice of themselves or their own desires or their own individual plans apart from God. You see, the story shows that they were so other-oriented that they did not even know that they were naked. It was only when they made a decision to go against God's loving protection and care and made a decision for themselves for the first time, they started taking concern from themselves. And their self-concern just consumed them more than anything else. It was only then, when this self-centeredness entered the story, that they realized that they were naked. And so they made some fig leaves and hid themselves from their nakedness. So we actually see, yes, Adam and Eve did die in the story. The ancient Near East writers weren't just forgetful. In the very day that they ate the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve died. But the very wise and detailed authors of this Old Testament story want to show us that this was not a physical death, where you cease to live and stop breathing and your heart doesn't beat anymore. But no, it's another kind of death. It's a spiritual death. They went from having a nature of other-orientedness to having a nature of self-centeredness. They literally went from life to death. Well, no, the text doesn't say that it's a spiritual death, like specifically, but we can pick up on this fact from the context clues that obviously they didn't die a physical death, but God said they're going to die. And we can pick this up from the whole rest of the Bible. And I'm going to spend the time I have left in this episode by going over this spiritual death as it unfurled in the Old Testament. The next thing that happens with Adam and Eve after they die and become self-centered is they run and hide from God. We're still in Genesis chapter 3 here. Their next self-centered instinct was to move away and reject God's presence by hiding in the woods. Fear and shame became their most driving inner force. They soon heard the sound of God walk in the garden paradise in the cool of the day, and instead of receiving that connectedness and that wholeness that relationship with God brings, instead of receiving their value and their worth and unconditional love from that being connected to the source of all life that connectedness brings, just as they had done all along before when they met with God, this time they felt scared, ashamed, and they ran and hid. The death they experienced in that day that they ate the forbidden fruit was the disconnectedness from God's presence and the life and the power that connectedness with God brings to one's inner being and one's human spirit. That was a mouthful. Let me say it again. The death that Adam and Eve experienced in that day when they ate that forbidden fruit, it was the disconnectedness from God's presence and the life and power that connectedness with God brings to one's inner being and one's human spirit. Man, the deepest part of them, their human spirit was now absent from the life that is in God. And this early story in Genesis, like I said, it sets up the whole narrative that we see throughout all the remaining books of the Old Testament, as if somehow this was inspired to do this, which is that humankind are slaves to their own brokenness and self-centeredness. We can't escape this slavery. Our brokenness and self-centeredness is inevitable. It's intrinsic to our very being because we are void of the life of God being in us. And every person is broken like this, disconnected from God. And because there's nothing we can do in our own power to rectify the situation, the cycle of brokenness and self-centeredness and sin keeps repeating down through every generation and continually and non-stop. I mean, generations upon generations upon generations of broken and self-centered people perpetuates itself. That's one of the main reasons why we see such evil being exchanged between people on earth, and it continues today. You see, wholeness is only found when we have the life of God empowering our human spirit. And being absent from that, which all of us are from our natural physical birth, we have no life in ourselves to be anything but self-centered. That's why we are slaves to sin. We're slaves to brokenness and self-centeredness because it's our inherent nature. That's the status check of our human spirit. That is our temperature check. That's what's going on. You see, it takes the life of God to be other-oriented, to be love-centered, because only God is completely other-oriented. And only God can cause one to act in perfect love. So what you see in the Bible is humanity's fallen spiritual condition of brokenness, and brokenness just all over and over again. Now that spiritual condition to which I just described, it's a really great summary of the Old Testament. You could take what I just said, having never read one page of the Old Testament, and you would perfectly summarize its contents. The Old Testament is a story of broken, self-centered people in whom God is trying to hold on to relationship with them and hopes to one day restore them by empowering them inwardly with his very own life. That's the only hope to be restored. And I'll say that again too. The Old Testament is a story of broken, self-centered people in whom God is trying to hold on a relationship with in hopes that one day he can restore them by empowering them inwardly with his own very life. According to the page of the Bible, humans are dead. Humans have no life in themselves. Their spiritual condition is death. They're literally the walking dead. Yeah, they breathe. Humans have a heartbeat and are able to do certain things, but they have no inner power within themselves to act holy, W-H-O-L-O-I, to be holy and completely loving to one another or even themselves. Boy, I know a lot about that. And God walks with humanity and faithfully continues to maintain relation with them all the way through the Old Testament. That's what you see. God is always faithful no matter what. Even in the midst of sin, God's faithful. Even when they don't walk faithfully with him. Because in hopes that one day they would freely choose to have life in him so that they would be empowered and set free from sin and brokenness and shame and all that self-centeredness that holds them in slavery. Whew. Now, when that happens, when humans receive the life of God inwardly, that is the full effect of what it means to be saved. Contrary to what you might have heard at church or at kids' Bible camp or vacation Bible school as a kid, at its core, to be saved is not merely talking about heaven or hell, and it's so sad that that's how that term has been thought of. But to be saved means we are freed from the slavery that our sin and self-centeredness holds us in. Now, I know that's going to rub a few people the wrong way, but I really believe this is true. The New Testament picks up on this story from the book of Genesis and continues this theme of this generational brokenness by saying in Romans chapter 5, the Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin. And so death spread to all humans because all sinned. And yes, we all die a physical death, but this is not the death that this passage is talking about. This is talking about the death that the first man, Adam, experienced, which is a death that he experienced in the same day he ate the forbidden fruit, even though he lived 930 years after that. Got it? And this passage is saying that afterward, that same spiritual death that Adam died has passed down to every single person, like a row of dominoes. Boof, 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 boof. Spiritual death. That's what we're talking about. Being separated from the life that's in God. In another passage, the Apostle Paul calls it being alienated from the life of God in Ephesians chapter 4. If we're alienated from the life of God, we're dead spiritually. And this is our spiritual condition apart from God. And this rings true all throughout the Old Testament, because it doesn't matter which characters you examine. Abraham, Moses, Samson, King David, any of the prophets, all the women too, all the people of Israel, all of them are suffering from brokenness, and they're unable to live in love with one another or maintain an unbroken relationship with God. Sure, maybe you can find a few folks that had maybe better character and maybe some less sinful attributes than the other. Sure, Saul was worse than David. Or maybe you can find a few that maintained a better relationship with God. But even the best of the best were still ridden with brokenness. David was a murderer. David committed adultery. I mean, he did all kinds of crazy things. So here's the kicker, guys. What you find in the Old Testament is that no matter what people did, there was no way of escaping this inherent brokenness and self-centeredness. It was always there. Every single person suffers from it. Now, of course, there's plenty of people who had a faith relationship with God in the Old Testament, right? Lots of people of faith. Hebrews chapter 11 is the hall of faith. And they're lifted up a little bit as people to look up to. And the scripture affirms that they walked and had relationship with God. But even in that relationship, you see, every person continued to find themselves a slave to brokenness and self-centeredness. Every person. You see, faith in God isn't enough to set a person free. Especially in the Old Testament. Just believing that God exists, or putting faith in God like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses and David did, that didn't make a person whole or restored. Because if that did, we would have saw those people being made whole and restored. See, that didn't repair the damage or make them spiritually alive. No, having a relationship with God in the Old Testament specifically did not free them from their propensity to sin, from their nature to sin. It didn't change their nature. It didn't change their broken spiritual condition. Sure, their faith and relationship with God may have made them right before God and in a good standing relationship. Like the scripture says in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, Abraham was accredited righteousness because he believed in God. But if you also read Abraham and his story, he was never saved from his sins. And no one else in the Old Testament who had faith in God and was righteous before him because they had a relationship was saved from their sin. They were still sinners. Get it? I hope you can see that, because it's a very important part of this whole story I'm trying to tell. The spiritual condition of those folks in the Old Testament, even those who were in relationship with God, was still dead. Even though they tried to be good, or tried to be good people, and had a relationship with God, they were dead. That pretty much sums up the whole Old Testament story, narrative, without us even having to read one page of it. So you're welcome for that. Okay, now that I've painted this picture of the fallen, broken, self-centered spiritual condition of humans that the Old Testament narrative reveals, a good question to stop and ask here is, what was God's plan to do about all this brokenness? I mean, how is God planning to fix this state of spiritual death that all humans inherently find themselves in? Well, many people believe that the answer lies in just giving people a list of things that they should do and a list of things they should not do. And then a good kick in the butt to get them done. Right? Pull yourself up by your bootstrap. Many people believe that humanity in themselves, inherent within themselves, have the power to overcome self-centeredness, overcome shame and brokenness. That we can just break free from sin by exercising our willpower and strengthening our willpower. And because of this, we look to rules to regulate behavior. We think if we can just get people to follow the rules, then everything's going to be just fine. And then we try our best to get people to follow the rules by shaming them, coercing them, judging them, or by putting consequences on their behavior. We think if we just make the consequences big enough, then humans won't do bad things to ourselves and to each other. If we just shame ourselves enough or coerce each other enough, that will make the world a better place and rid ourselves of self-centeredness. In fact, many people believe that God's giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses and all the Israelites that were standing at the mountain with him think this was God's solution too. We think that God's solution to humanity's problem with sin was to just tell his people not to sin and not to do it, because that's what the Ten Commandments basically are, and all the 613 other laws that are in the, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And some of us think that if we just put up a list of 10 commandments in our schools and our public monuments and our political institutions, that somehow our society is going to become a better place. But folks, I'm telling you, an accurate study of the Bible will tell you that this is exactly the opposite. I know that's going to sound like a shock to people, but God's purposes in giving the 10 Commandments was not to solve the problem of brokenness and self-centeredness of sin. It wasn't. The 10 Commandments were not given to solve the problem. If we look at the story of the Old Testament, what we actually find is that even though the ancient Israelites had a list of what not to do, no one was able to live up to the righteousness requirement of the law of Moses. Nobody. And the only people who claimed that they did were the religious leaders like the Pharisees, during Jesus' day. And Jesus came and rebuked them as being complete hypocrites. You see, everybody fails to keep the 10 Commandments and to live in love with one another. No one gets it right 100% of the time. No one bats 1,000. And yet, as the Apostle Paul said in the book of Romans chapter 7, this was the actual purpose that God gave the 10 Commandments. To show people that they cannot free themselves in and of their own power. They can't free themselves from their sin or their brokenness or their self-centeredness by just doing it on their own. That was the purpose of the law. Now, some of you grew up in the church, but I've just had a knee-jerk reaction to that, but that's 100% true. The giving of the Mosaic law wasn't God's attempt to try and fix the problem of humanity's broken and powerless human spirit. It was, one, to show them what brokenness even was and what it looked like. Two, how badly they could not get free from this brokenness, which was a fact reminded to them by this perpetual amount of animal sacrifice they need to offer up for their sin. And three, it was to lead them to Jesus, who would eventually bring the spiritual answer that they needed to fix the problem. Now, I don't have time in this podcast to go over all the passages of Scripture that back up what I just said, but you can find them on your own in Romans chapter 6 through 7 and Galatians chapter 2 through 8. It's all there. And those are some pretty complex books and passages of the Bible, and it takes a while to get through all those passages. So rather having to explain that in detail, I'm just going to provide a nice little summary that you can take with you if you want to check those chapters out on your own. But listen, there's There's nothing wrong with trying to keep the Ten Commandments and trying to do good. In fact, the Apostle Paul confirms that. The Ten Commandments and the 13 laws of Moses, he confirms that they're good. He says this in Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 12. He says specifically in verse 12 that the law, the Ten Commandments, is holy, righteous, and good. In fact, I believe it's in one of the first and second Thessalonians that says that we know that the law is good if you know how to use it. See, the law is a good thing. It's not something to be escaped from, which unfortunately is how many in the church have interpreted these passages. But because of humanity's fallen, broken, and death-like condition of the human spirit, see, that resides in every person, we have no power to carry these guidelines and regulations out. Even if we're praying, even if we're talking with God, or we're in a religious relationship with rituals and routines, like the people of the Old Testament were. You know, they were doing sacrifices, they were going to synagogue, they were reciting the right prayers and so forth. But those folks, see, the power to make the person whole and to act in other-oriented love was missing. Because you're just trying to do it out of yourself. I love how the Apostle Paul says this exact thing in verse 18 of the same chapter 7 of Romans by saying, you see, for I have the desire to do what's right, he says, but not the ability to carry it out. Here Paul is not denying that our intentions aren't true and from the heart. But just as he says, there's no power to carry out those good intentions. And why is there a lack of power? I'll answer that right now. Paul gives the answer in verse 14. This is, in my opinion, the crux of the whole thing. He says, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. What Paul is saying is that the ability to do right is spiritual, meaning that it emanates from the spiritual realm, meaning that it emanates from God himself. That's where the power comes from. The ability to do what's right comes from God, not man. There's nothing within a person's flesh and blood, their molecules of matter, their willpower, their mind, their emotions. There's nothing in those things that enables a person to do what's right. Just as Paul said, the law is spiritual. Are you following me? Go back and read real quick the question, or if I go back to the question that I asked in the beginning of the segment, which was, what was God's plan to do about all this brokenness in the Old Testament? How is God going to fix this state of spiritual death that all humans inherently find themselves in? Well, God's answer to that was not giving us the laws and trying to keep us by threatening us with consequences so we just conjure up enough willpower to do it. No, the problem with our brokenness is a spiritual problem. The law is spiritual, not willpower based, which means we need a spiritual answer to fix our brokenness. We need empowerment in our human spirits that only the life of God can bring. That is the spiritual answer to the spiritual problem. Our heart, our innermost being, our soul, our human spirit must be empowered with the life of God. Otherwise, we're merely just left with willpower, submission, and obedience. You know, obey what God wants us to do and submit and accomplish that with willpower. Just try harder, resist. Man, have you ever felt like that's exactly what the church has been telling you? God demands holiness, so now be holy. And that bologna sandwich, that BS, never works. It never worked for me. And it never worked for anyone in the Old Testament either. And even if you do get some kind of results with that approach, then you are the one that gets the gloat. Look at me. Look at my rule following. Look at my self-control. Look at my great willpower, my strength, and so on. Which leads one to being prideful in yourself and judgmental towards others who can't live up to your standard. Listen, obeying doesn't bring wholeness to your human spirit. Willpower doesn't bring empowerment into your human spirit. And submission doesn't change a person's heart. Get it? Do you see how empty that approach is? And that is exactly what God was trying to teach the people of the Old Testament when he gave the Ten Commandments. When he gave all those laws, he was trying to teach them what sin was and how pitiful they were to be able to walk in freedom in their own power. And all this was supposed to be like a schoolmaster, a teacher to bring them to Jesus. You can find that in Galatians chapter 3. Guys, what we need is life. We need an infusion with the life of God into the deepest parts of our being, so that we are healed from our brokenness and separation from God, so that by having his life in us, we naturally and organically desire to love in an other-oriented manner. We need an infusion with the life of God so that we can be made whole from the brokenness we have, so we can no longer shoot ourselves in the foot with our own brokenness and affect others with our brokenness, right? And folks, this was God's plan all along. God's plan to fix the perpetual brokenness that started with the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, back in Genesis, and went all the way through the Old Testament, was to send Jesus into the world so that through him, he could repair this brokenness and empower and bring life to our innermost being. So that after this empowerment with his life, we can then walk in the same love that God walks in. This right here, this is the entire hope of the gospel. That our character becomes just like God as he shares with us of his own divine nature. This is the salvation that Jesus wants to bring and offers to all of us who receive him. Now, this gospel I'm preaching wasn't some new thing that Jesus came up with on the spot when he took upon flesh and walked among us 2,000 years ago. This spiritual empowerment was spoken of and prophesied long before by the authors of the Old Testament. God broke through and got into their thinking, this revelation, which is really cool. We're going to look at that. Now, but I admit, this plan is not so clear when you look at some of the older texts of the Old Testament, like Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, and all that stuff. You don't really see this when you look at the Mosaic Law and the story of the Israelites as told through all those books. Much of this is because in those books, you see, God is mostly dealing with the nation of Israel as a whole. He's not really speaking so much about our individual propensity to sin and our individual brokenness. But this focus changes later on in Israel's story as God reveals more about his plan. We see God's spiritual empowerment plan, the gospel that Jesus preaches of infusing us with his life, is spoken about in two different places in these later prophetic Old Testament books. And we find them in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, at least the two that I want to bring out. Ezekiel 36 and 37 have these two passages concerning God's future work of life and empowerment to our human spirit. Literally, directly. Listen to what this says. Ezekiel says this in 36. I will put my spirit in you, and you shall live. And I will place you on your own soil, and then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act, says the Lord. The second passage from chapter 37 says, a new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will take out that heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you to make you follow my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances. Man, Ezekiel makes this new work of God so clear it's impossible to miss. He prophesizes that there's going to be a future time when God is going to remove this fallen nature of brokenness in our heart, in our human spirit. And God himself is going to infuse us with his spirit. He said he will literally put his spirit within you. And man, when God puts a spirit in you, that's none other than his life itself. God is saying through Ezekiel that into our deepest, most inner being, his presence will come to invade us. And by doing so, it will organically make us follow his ordinances and his commands and his statutes. Which, in saying we're going to follow his statutes and ordinances, listen, that's just a religious way of saying it's going to help us to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Because remember, Jesus summed up the entire Old Testament law by just saying to love others and to love God. That's all it means. See, the ability to break free from self-centeredness and sin, it doesn't come from a person's will. It doesn't come from your obedience or your submission. You might be able to get a little ways down the road with that. You can white knuckle it, but you're not going to break free from it. You're always going to be fighting it. The prophet is saying that it comes from God's Spirit. It's a spiritual solution. And to be spiritually empowered can only come from God. That's the only way to break free from the slavery we are entangled in called the flesh. Now, the prophet Jeremiah also makes this heart change reality clear in chapter 31 of his book. He prophesies about this time period by saying this, "And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for their own good and for the good of their children after them. I will make with them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them. And I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good and will plant them in this land of faithfulness with all my heart and all my soul." Jeremiah here emulates what we saw in Ezekiel with God coming in and changing the heart or the human spirit of a person. This is the deciding factor that brings the fear of God to us. And the fear of God, which is kind of a term that doesn't make sense in our culture and in the context here, but it means it instills in us the ability to walk in love with one another seriously and solemnly, knowing that when we fail to do this, it brings brokenness to ourselves, to others, and to our relation with God, and even to creation itself. Self-centeredness is, man, that's a serious thing, because it affects the people who we live and interact with and ourselves. So it is a reverential type of fear, and it's an appropriate word when we consider the damage that our sin and brokenness can have on this world. But Jeremiah also adds in some language in this passage with the word covenant. Jeremiah tells us that in this glorious day, everything's going to be different. In this day, a brand new covenant or agreement is going to be instituted by God. And this new work that God does is going to change everything. It's a whole new covenant. It won't be merely an agreement that serves like a document or a way that we can now relate to God differently legally, but it's a complete new relationship with God that deals with our innermost being. This new era, God is bringing an inner covenant change, not an external covenant. That's what he did with the Israelites by giving them the 10 Commandments. It was all external, just giving them rules to follow. But in this new covenant, God is empowering them with the very life that enables them to live out the love of God. Whew. Jeremiah also says in chapter 32, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke." Well, partly it wasn't their fault, but "though I was their husband, declares the Lord." Now I'm just going to stop there. That's the first part of the passage, because It's a comment on what Jeremiah just said about the Old Covenant. He's talking about the 613 laws, which included the 10 commandments that God gave to Moses to the Israelites in the wilderness. There are many great things about those instructions, like, hey, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder, to love your neighbor as yourself, and all those things, think about it. They're really good things. But just as Jeremiah said, Israelites broke the covenant. Why? Because they couldn't keep it. Because just giving a law to a person doesn't empower a person with the power to carry it out. Giving a person an instruction to do something does not give them the power to do it. That's why in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, it says that God found this old covenant to be faulty. He found fault with the old covenant. Not that the law was bad. We've already affirmed that Scripture says that the law is good. But God found fault with the people being able to keep it. It wasn't complete. It wasn't a very good covenant because it didn't give the people the ability to do it. For example, I could tell a person, or I could hire someone, to go out and break up some old concrete in my driveway, because I'm going to put a new driveway in. But unless they have a jackhammer or a sledgehammer to do the job, they're not going to be able to do it. They might be the strongest person in the world, but if they don't have the empowerment to carry out the job, they're just as worthless as anyone else who do it, whether they're a 300-pound bodybuilder or if they're 80-pound 13-year-old, right? And that is exactly the state of the Israelites when God gave them the old covenant to follow. But notice what Jeremiah says about this new covenant. And I'll read the rest of the passage here. This is verse 33. For this is the new covenant I'm going to make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. He gets specific. Here it is. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. The Apostle Paul talks about this also in Romans chapter 2. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. From the least to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. You see, in this new covenant, God puts the very desire to do what was originally at the heart of the old covenant. He puts it inside of our inmost being, inside of our human spirit. He writes it on our hearts. So what Ezekiel and Jeremiah are both saying here is that in the day in which this new covenant is struck between God and man, human beings are going to be empowered in their spirit through God's own Spirit, birthing in them the love of God. And that love of God is going to be established within the human heart in such a way that it organically produces other-oriented love. This merging of our spiritual DNA takes out the stony heart of flesh, which is self-centeredness, and through it we become infused with the life of God that heals our brokenness, restores our inner spiritual connection with God, and then gives us the ability to love in the same way that Jesus loved. Now, of course, it's in seed form. We'll talk about that in the next couple of episodes, but it's there. And it's in you, and it is the real you. It's a part of you that is the truest part of you. Your identity has changed after this experience. And all of this is why Jesus, you see, is the focal point of the whole biblical story. And he's the mystery of the ages, it says. He's the hope of glory and the hope of the whole world. Jesus is not only the one who's the bearer and the one who comes in to initiate this new covenant, but he himself becomes the very life source for this miraculous interchange. Jesus puts his Spirit in us. This spiritual answer, this hope to our brokenness and sin, this empowerment to walk in the love of God is dubbed in the New Testament the new birth. Or as I've called it in this mini-series, being born from above. And what Jesus does to us, specifically in this new birth, we're going to talk about it next time in part 3, maybe part 4 too. And we're going to look at some of the New Testament passages that explain and describe this new birth within us, and the hope that all those who choose to be born again in Christ are empowered with. Whew, that was a mouthful. And that's it for today, folks. So we'll see you next time. Be like Jesus and be blessed.